All right, let's dive into a really fascinating look at cold cases today. We're focusing on the perspective of someone right in the thick of it for decades.
Yeah, we're unpacking an interview with Paul Holes, the veteran investigator. He's pretty well known for his work on the Golden State Killer case.
Exactly. And this interview, it draws from his career reflections, his book Unmasked. It gives us quite a window.
And it's not just like the procedural stuff, the how they caught him. This source really lets us dig into the deeper things.
Like his methods.
Yeah, his methods, which were sometimes unusual. And, what we learned about the offender himself from that investigation, and also the human cost. That comes through really strongly.
That's a huge part of it. So our mission here for this deep dive is really to pull out those key insights. We want to understand Holmes' specific approach, definitely.
Right. And what decades of this work, especially this huge case, tell us about a predator like the Golden State Killer?
And that impact you mentioned on victims, sure, but also on the investigators putting their lives into this.
Absolutely. It's quite a story.
Okay then, let's untack this. So first off, Paul Holes. Anyone following true crime probably knows the name. He spent, over 20 years on cold cases in California?
Yeah, a long time, often working kind of solo, which we'll get into. And his persistence was just, critical in finally identifying Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. as the Golden State Killer.
And just to frame it, the GSK, Golden State Killer, we're talking about a terrifying figure responsible for at least 13 murders, 50 rapes across California back in the 70s and 80s.
The scale is just, hard to comprehend.
And what struck me about Hull's approach from this interview was him calling himself a lone wolf. He often handled these massive, complex cases largely on his own.
Less collaborative, at least initially.
And there's this story he tells. It's almost unbelievable. The day before he was supposed to retire, DeAngelo is the prime suspect. They know it's likely him.
What did he do?
He drove to DeAngelo's house by himself.
Wow. Just drove there, alone.
Yep. Pulled up outside, just sat there, apparently debating whether he could, somehow get a DNA sample right then and there.
That's intense.
He looks back on it now, he says, how incredibly foolish that was. Officer safety. Completely out the window, no backup, no real plan, just this intense drive.
That really speaks volumes, doesn't it?
Yeah.
About the pressure, that single-minded focus these cases demand. Maybe pushing past protocols even.
It shows how deep it gets under your skin, I think.
Definitely. So moving from the investigator to the offender, one thing Holes really emphasizes is the importance of visiting the actual crime scenes, the neighborhoods too.
Right, not just looking at maps or files.
Exactly. And what's fascinating here with the Golden State Killer is the sheer geographic spread. That name, Golden State Killer, it's not an exaggeration.
He's all over.
Yeah, sometimes hundreds of miles between attacks, all across California.
Right.
So visiting those places, it helped contextualize, how he moved, the opportunities he saw.
And those neighborhoods specifically, what did looking at them reveal?
Well, he noticed a pattern. The attacks weren't random low-income areas. Often they were upper-middle, even upper-class neighborhoods.
Okay, so what does that suggest?
That's significant. It starts building a profile that maybe wasn't the first assumption. It suggested this wasn't, some marginalized guy hiding in the shadows.
Right, someone who could fit in there.
Exactly. Someone comfortable in those environments, which, hinted at what they later found out DeAngelo was a former cop. Trained in burglaries. He knew police tactics.
He knew how to operate without being seen, how law enforcement thought.
Precisely.
Now, the capture, that's often the focus for the public, but the interview makes it really clear, chillingly clear, that for the victims, the trauma didn't end when he left.
No, absolutely not. He seemed to actively perpetuate it, sometimes for years, even decades.
That's just awful. What kinds of things?
Well, Holes gives some specific examples. There was one woman. Years later, she goes to her vacation home and finds the thermostat set differently. Her immediate thought, he was here.
Oh my God, just that constant fear.
Yeah. Another victim apparently was so terrified he might still be out there, she actually moved to Mexico.
Wow, and wasn't there something about phone calls?
Yes. This is maybe the most disturbing part. He'd call some victims, sometimes years after the attack, just to let them know he was still around. His words, apparently.
That's a whole other level of cruelty. It's not just the violence, it's psychological torture.
It really is. It speaks to a very, very disturbing mindset, prolonging the fear, the control, long after the crime itself.
So The hunt. You mentioned the scale. The source talks about wading through 15,000 pages of case files.
15,000. Can you imagine? It's not like reading a novel. It's like digging through an entire library for just one person.
And this massive effort also involved, kind of unexpectedly, the late crime writer Michelle McNamara.
Right, she was working on her book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, and she got deeply involved, not just observing, really digging in.
The interview paints her almost like one of the investigators.
Yeah, Holes says she really acted like one. She went through the same emotional roller coaster, you know. Getting excited at a potential suspect, getting DNA results back.
And then the disappointment when it wasn't a match.
Exactly, that constant up and down that investigators live with.
There's also this really poignant detail Holes shared about McNamara after she passed away.
Oh yeah.
She'd been scanning and uploading documents constantly, using some file transfer service to share them. After Holes found out she died, he actually got an email notification, a new file upload from her.
No way, like automated.
Must have been queued up or something. But it meant her work, her contribution, it literally continued even after she was gone, helping him access things she'd already processed.
Wow. That's incredibly moving, actually.
It really is. So the big breakthrough, the thing that finally cracked it, it wasn't traditional police work, not entirely. It was investigative genealogy DNA.
Right. This relatively new technique, at least in law enforcement terms, it's where technology needs really old school detective work, kind of.
It was adapted from something else, wasn't it? Like for adoptees.
Exactly. How adoptees find biological relatives. They took the Golden State Killer's DNA, the unknown sample left at crime scenes decades ago,
and uploaded it to genealogy databases, the ones people voluntarily use.
Yeah, the ones they had permission to search, of course. Publicly accessible ones people opted into.
But that didn't just give them DeAngelo's name, right?
No, not directly. It gave them a list of people who shared some DNA with the killer, relatives. Could be distant cousins, third cousins, whatever.
Okay, so then what?
Then the painstaking work begins. Using public records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, census data, obituaries, they build family trees. They go back in time to find common ancestors for these relatives.
And then forward again.
And they build the tree down from those ancestors, looking for descendants who fit the profile. Right age range, male, crucially, connection to California during the crime spree.
That sounds incredibly time-consuming.
Oh, massively.
Yeah.
And once they had potential suspects narrowed down from those trees in public records.
Then they needed his actual DNA to compare.
Right. That's the final step.
Right.
They had to covertly get a direct DNA sample from the suspect, usually something discarded, like from his trash, then compare that directly to the crime scene DNA.
And for DeAngelo, it matched.
It matched. That's how they got him. It's amazing, really persistence, new tech, but also that careful, methodical genealogical research.
It really highlights the blend. But shifting gears a bit from the tech and the case files to the human side, the source really drives home the personal cost of this work for investigators like Holes.
Yeah, this is a crucial piece. It's not just a job, is it? You're immersed in the absolute worst moments of people's lives, day after day, year after year. What does that actually do to you?
Holes talks about it quite openly, seeing details from cases involving child victims, the photos, seeing toys in their rooms.
Oh, that must be incredibly hard.
And how that would overlay onto his own life. He had kids around the same age. He describes feeling that weight constantly.
But in that law enforcement culture, especially back then, there's this pressure, right? To be strong, keep it together.
Yeah, he talks about feeling the need to just bury the emotional trauma, compartmentalize it, to stay focused, to not seem weak. It becomes almost a survival tactic on the job.
But you can only do that for so long.
Exactly. He describes having a pretty significant psychological breakdown after he finally retired. All that buried stuff came rushing out.
Understandable.
And he saw therapists who gave him this incredibly powerful analogy. She said every time he buried one of those traumas, it was like a little nick, a small cut.
Okay.
And over decades of doing that, he'd accumulated so many nicks that eventually he was just bleeding out emotionally.
Wow. That's a really vivid way to put it. Bleeding out emotionally, it captures that cumulative burden perfectly.
And Holes emphasizes, the point of his book, Unmasked, it isn't just, here's how I solved the case. It's vital for people to understand the impact, the sacrifices investigators and their families make.
That hidden cost behind the badge and the headlines.
Which leads to the final point the source touches on. Holes' perspective on the whole true crime phenomenon, coming from someone who lived real crime.
Right, it's exploded as a genre. What's his take?
He basically says, look, it's okay to be interested, to learn about these cases, even about the offenders, but there's a line.
Which is this?
You don't glorify the killer, ever.
That seems crucial.
And you always have to remember the human cost. He points out something interesting. At true crime conventions or events these days, it's possible, even likely, that survivors or victims' family members are right there in the audience.
That really puts it in perspective. It's not just a story.
Exactly. It might be presented as entertainment books, podcasts, shows, but it stems from real people's worst nightmares. Their lives were shattered. So maintaining that respect, that ethical understanding is absolutely paramount.
A really important reminder for anyone consuming this kind of content.
So wrapping up this deep dive, we've journeyed from the often solitary grind of a cold case investigator like Holes,
Through the chilling insights into how an offender like the Golden State Killer operated, his psychology.
touched on the innovative tech, the genealogy DNA that finally brought a breakthrough.
They really spend time on that profound human cost for the victims enduring ongoing trauma and for the investigators carrying that emotional weight for years.
Yeah. Hopefully this gives you, the listener, a much fuller picture. It's so much more than just the headlines about a case being solved. There are layers upon layers.
The dedication, the trauma, the breakthroughs, the ethical considerations, it's all intertwined.
And it leaves us with something important to think about, doesn't it? Considering that heavy emotional toll on investigators we talked about, that analogy of bleeding out emotionally, and the fact that victims' trauma doesn't just end. What's our responsibility? As people who listen to these stories, read these books.
How do we engage with true crime respectfully, knowing the real human suffering behind it?
Exactly. How do we make sure we honor that reality? Something to definitely keep in mind as you encounter these stories.